In the winter of 1934, the Colorado River dropped. It was not the first time the river had receded along its passage through the Grand Canyon, and the engineers who had spent the previous 2 years overseeing the construction of Hoover Dam upstream understood that impounding the river at Black Canyon would alter its behavior downstream in ways that hydrology could predict only in general terms. What they could not predict, and what the records of the National Park Service from that February document with a brevity that reads today as deliberate, was what appeared on a stretch of canyon wall south of the confluence with the Little Colorado River when the water pulled back far enough to expose bedrock that had not been visible in any period of recorded observation. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A ranger stationed at the South Rim wrote in his log for the 14th of February 1934 that a patrol boat operating along the inner gorge had returned, with a report he described only as requiring immediate attention from the superintendent's office. The patrol boat's crew had found something cut into the rock, not carved by water pressure or fractured along a geological seam, cut by hand, in a pattern that repeated itself with the regularity that only deliberate work produces across a vertical surface. What they described in that initial report, before the language became careful and the paperwork began moving through proper channels, was a staircase. It descended from a ledge above the waterline into exposed bedrock below, following the canyon wall at a deliberate angle, too geometrically consistent to be natural, too extensive in its reach down the schist face to be dismissed as surface erosion or mineral patterning. The steps, by the crew's count made from a boat moving slowly along the base of the cliff, numbered more than 40 before the formation disappeared below the sediment line and passed into the riverbank. The superintendent's office in Grand Canyon Village received the report on the 15th. By the 22nd, the inner gorge along that stretch had been closed to all river traffic under a Park Service administrative order. It remained closed for 31 days. Then the order was lifted, the river traffic resumed, and the official account of what had been found during those 31 days was filed in terms that have made it nearly impossible to locate, verify, or contest in the decades since. The closure of a section of the Colorado River within Grand Canyon National Park in February and March of 1934 was not concealed from the administrative record. It was documented. The National Park Service maintained administrative files from this period, and those files show the closure order, its effective dates, its duration, and its authorization by the regional office in Santa Fe. What they do not show, with any precision that allows the closure to be understood from the outside, is the reason. The administrative file lists the justification as survey operations and channel assessment. That phrase appears in multiple Park Service documents from the 1930s, applied across a range of situations where a more specific explanation would have required the agency to disclose something it was not yet prepared to address in public correspondence. The distinction between what the file says and what it means is important, because the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon was not, in 1934, a corridor anyone had mapped with particular care below the waterline. John Wesley Powell's survey of 1869 had established the river's navigability and documented its major rapids and side canyons from a boat moving through them. Subsequent expeditions by Ellsworth Kolb, Julius Stone, and the United States Geological Survey had added to what Powell recorded, but each of those efforts had been concerned primarily with the river itself and with the canyon's accessible ledges and terraces. The inner gorge, the deepest section of the canyon's cutting, where the river moves through a corridor of Vishnu Schist that geologists date to approximately 1.7 billion years before the present, remained one of the least systematically observed stretches of landscape in the continental United States. A formation on that wall, visible only because the river had dropped below the level at which it had moved during all prior periods of recorded observation, would have been genuinely new to every institutional framework the Park Service possessed. The patrol crew that found it had no category for what they were looking at. The superintendent's office, receiving their report, understood immediately that a category would need to be established before anything else could proceed, and that establishing a category of that kind was not a task that could be accomplished in the ordinary course of park administration without attracting exactly the kind of attention the 31-day closure was designed to forestall. The Havasupai people, whose ancestral territory has included the canyon and the plateau country above it for centuries before the federal government claimed jurisdiction over either, were not consulted during the 31-day closure. Their oral tradition holds accounts of the canyon's inner geography that no Park Service administrator in 1934 had read or been trained to consider as evidence relevant to an administrative finding. The Havasupai described the world below the canyon floor as a place their ancestors knew well, a geography of passages and chambers and surfaces marked by the people who used them before the present world began. This is not a tradition assembled in response to contact with European ideas about underground spaces or with archaeological discoveries made by government-affiliated survey teams. It predates the park, predates the territorial surveys, predates the Powell expedition, and predates the executive orders of the 1880s that stripped the Havasupai of access to the canyon rim and confined them to the narrow floor of Havasu Canyon, several miles west of the Colorado. The ethnographer Frank Hamilton Cushing, who spent time among canyon-adjacent communities during the 1880s as part of a Smithsonian-affiliated fieldwork program in the American Southwest, recorded fragments of Havasupai accounts in which stone paths descending along the river's edge were described as features of the landscape placed there by the people who came before. Cushing's notes from this period, preserved in the correspondence files of the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology, describe what he called architectural modifications to the canyon wall at a location he could not fix precisely from the surface, but placed within the inner gorge south of the Little Colorado confluence. Those notes were never formally published. They appear in Cushing's private letters, but not in the reports he submitted to the Bureau. The gap between what he recorded for himself and what he placed in the institutional record is the kind of gap that appears when a careful observer encounters something the institution funding the observation is not equipped to receive and has not prepared a procedure for addressing. The Vishnu Schist that composes the canyon's inner gorge is among the hardest rock formations anywhere in North America. Its resistance to cutting, to shaping, to any modification that requires penetrating its crystalline surface is a function of the metamorphic compression it has undergone across nearly 2 billion years of geological history. The dark, glittering walls of the inner gorge that catch the low winter light and hold it differently from the canyon's upper formations of limestone and sandstone are composed of a material that resists modification at a scale that any experienced stoneworker would have recognized immediately. Working it with steel tools is difficult and slow. Working it with stone tools, or with whatever instrumentation produced a staircase consistent enough in step height and wall angle that a patrol crew moving along the base of the cliff in a riverboat could count more than 40 distinct steps before the feature disappeared into the sediment, would require either a sustained labor investment extending across multiple generations or a technique for cutting metamorphic rock that the current archaeological models of pre-contact North American civilization have not formally incorporated into their accounts of what was possible before European contact. The superintendent's memorandum, written 2 days after the closure order was issued, described the formation in terms that reflect the discomfort of a man trying to be accurate about what the patrol crew had reported without saying more than the institutional context could support. He noted that the steps were of roughly uniform height, that they followed the wall's angle rather than cutting directly into it, and that no geological process he could identify would account for the regularity of the feature at the scale the crew described. He used the phrase "not consistent with natural formation" 3 times in a document of less than 4 pages. The repetition has the quality of a person making sure the record shows that they understood what they were being told, and did not mistake a natural feature for a constructed one. It also has the quality of a person who understood that what the crew had seen would require explanation eventually, and who was recording, in the most careful terms available to him, the fact that he was not yet in a position to provide one. The photographs referenced in a supply request filed on the 28th of February described in that request as canyon wall documentation from the closure survey, do not appear in the photographic archive that the Park Service maintains for the Grand Canyon from this period. The supply request itself survived. It asks for additional photographic film stock and for surveying equipment of a type used for measuring vertical surfaces at close range, equipment that would have been appropriate for documenting a carved formation on a cliff face. The photographs the request was written to support are absent from every archival collection that researchers have been able to identify. At the Bureau of American Ethnology, a request for consultation dated in March of 1934 appears in the Bureau's incoming correspondence file. The request, from the Park Service Regional Office in Santa Fe, asked whether the Bureau held any existing documentation of constructed or modified features in the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, or any record of indigenous testimony describing constructed passages along the canyon's inner walls. The Bureau's reply, if one was drafted and sent, is not held in either institution's archive in any form that has been located by researchers working through the relevant collections. The request exists as a record of the question being asked. The answer does not exist as a record of what was found. That kind of archival gap is common enough in records from this period that it does not by itself demonstrate deliberate removal or reclassification. What it demonstrates is that the matter was considered significant enough to generate a consultation request to a major federal research institution, and that the response to that request, whatever it contained, did not pass into the public record in a form that could subsequently be read, cited, or built upon. The Hopi people, whose oral traditions have been a subject of ethnographic documentation since the late 19th century, hold accounts of the Grand Canyon as a place of emergence and descent that constitutes some of the most geographically specific ancestral memory preserved in any indigenous tradition of the American Southwest. The Sipapu, the sacred opening through which the ancestors passed into the present world from the worlds that preceded it, is located by Hopi tradition along the Little Colorado River near its confluence with the Colorado, within the inner gorge. Hopi elders who spoke with the ethnographer Alexander Stephen during the 1890s described the approach to the Sipapu as involving a series of descents, physical passages through the canyon's levels that moved the traveler from the surface world downward through formations that were themselves understood as thresholds between one mode of existence and another. Stephen's field notes from this period, held in manuscript form at the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, contain an account recorded from an elder of the Bear Clan, in which stone markings on the river wall near the confluence are described as placed there by the people who made the descent in the time before this world began. The elder used a term that Stephen transliterated carefully and glossed as something close to worn trail on rock, a translation Stephen noted was approximate because the Hopi word carried both the physical fact of the marking and its function as navigational record, as evidence of which direction the descent ran and how far it extended before the next passage opened. The markings the elder described were not metaphorical features of a spiritual tradition. They were described as actual physical features of the canyon wall, material evidence of a geography that the people who came before the Hopi had known and used and marked, so that the knowledge of the passage would not be lost between generations. Stephen's published version of his journal, which appeared in 1936 under the editorship of Elsie Clews Parsons, does not contain this account. The passage is present in the manuscript notes but absent from the published text. Parsons left no written record of why the passage was removed from the text she prepared for publication. The manuscript notes survive at Flagstaff. The published account that most readers of Hopi oral tradition encountered for the following decades does not contain what the manuscript describes. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The canyon the Hopi were describing in those accounts is the same canyon the patrol crew moved through in the winter of 1934. The wall is the same wall. The schist is the same schist, dark and glittering under the low winter light, carrying on its crystalline surface the patterning of geological time at a scale that the human presence in the canyon, however ancient, represents only the most recent fraction. What the patrol crew encountered with no preparation, with no tradition to organize or contextualize what they saw, was a formation that the Hopi oral record had been describing as physical evidence of a world preceding this one, for as long as the tradition itself could be traced through living memory. Whether those two things, the steps counted from a patrol boat in February of 1934 and the stone markings described by a Bear Clan elder in the 1890s, describe the same feature in the same location, cannot be confirmed from the records that currently exist in any accessible archive. What can be said is that both the physical description and the traditional account are oriented toward the same stretch of canyon wall in the same section of the inner gorge, involve the same material cut into the same geological formation, and were produced independently of each other across a span of time during which no institution thought to place them in proximity and ask what their convergence might mean for the question of who shaped things in this landscape and when. The closure ended on the 25th of March 1934. River traffic resumed under the ordinary permit procedures. The superintendent's monthly report for April makes no reference to the formation, the closure, the consultation request to the Bureau of American Ethnology, or the photographs that appear in a supply request but not in any archive. The administrative file for the closure sits in the Park Service record system, dated, numbered, and catalogued in the appropriate series. Its contents are the closure order, the supply request, and the two memoranda from the superintendent. Everything else that would ordinarily accompany a month-long closure of a significant section of a national park, field notes from the survey operations the closure was said to enable, correspondence between the superintendent and the regional office during the 31 days the river was closed, a final report summarizing the findings of the channel assessment, any communication with the Bureau of American Ethnology that followed the consultation request, is absent from the file as it currently exists. The Havasupai had no formal mechanism through which to ask what had been found in the section of river their ancestors had traveled for generations. Their land base had been reduced to a fraction of what those ancestors had used. Their access to the inner gorge was legally constrained by reservation boundaries that placed the canyon wall outside their jurisdiction, and the institutional structure managing the canyon had been built, since the park's establishment in 1919, around the framework that placed their knowledge in the category of folklore rather than evidence. The Park Service's formal relationship with the Havasupai would not change substantially until 1975, when an act of Congress restored a portion of their ancestral lands. By then, the people who had filed the closure order and drafted the memoranda were gone, and the photographs that were supposed to document the canyon wall documentation had been absent from the archive for more than 4 decades. The inner gorge is not a place that changes on a human timescale. The rock that took nearly 2 billion years to form under conditions of heat and pressure that no longer exist at the surface does not surrender the marks cut into it without force far greater than river water at ordinary levels can provide. A carved feature set into the schist below the high water line, covered during periods of high water by the river itself, and exposed only when the water drops below the level that obtained during the entire period of recorded observation, would retain its geometry across the 90 years since the patrol crew counted its steps from a moving boat. The construction of Hoover Dam changed the Colorado's seasonal behavior in the canyon permanently and measurably. The spring floods that once scoured the inner gorge and deposited sediment against its walls during recession no longer occur at the scale they reached in pre-dam years. The sediment the river once carried in those floods, material that would have built up against the schist walls during high water and been partially removed during low water, has been dramatically reduced by the dam's impoundment of what the river would otherwise carry downstream. Whether those changes have left the staircase formation more exposed to modern observation, more buried under altered sediment patterns, or unchanged in its position below the altered low water line, is not something the hydrological record addresses, because the hydrological record does not acknowledge the existence of the feature it might affect. What happened in the weeks between the closure order and its lifting is a question the archive cannot answer, but the geography of the closure itself carries information that the file's sparse contents do not. The inner gorge between the Little Colorado confluence and the stretch of river immediately south covers approximately 7 miles of navigable water, moving through a corridor where the walls rise more than 1,000 feet on both sides, and daylight reaches the riverbed for only a few hours each day at this time of year. Closing that corridor to river traffic for 31 days in February and March required a formal order from the regional office, coordination with any permitted river party that might have been in the area, and the presence of Park Service personnel capable of enforcing the closure against anyone who might attempt to move through the corridor without authorization. None of that administrative activity, which would ordinarily generate correspondence and field reports and daily logs, appears in the file. The file contains the order, the file contains the supply request, the file contains the 2 memoranda from the superintendent. The 31 days between the closure and its lifting are represented in the administrative record by a silence that is itself a kind of shape, the shape of something that happened and was not written down, or was written down and did not pass into the collections where it could be found. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology had been collecting indigenous testimony about the canyon since the 1880s, when Cushing and his contemporaries were making their first systematic contact with the communities whose oral traditions described the landscape in terms that the geological surveys of the same period could not accommodate. By 1934, the Bureau held a collection of fieldwork notes, correspondence, and published reports relating to the canyon and its surrounding indigenous traditions that represented more than 4 decades of institutional engagement with the subject. The consultation request from the Park Service Regional Office asking whether the Bureau held documentation of constructed features in the inner gorge was addressed to an institution that had been in a position to answer it for a generation. The absence of a surviving reply is not in itself unusual. What is unusual is the combination of the request's specificity, asking not about the canyon generally, but about constructed or modified features in the inner gorge specifically, with the complete absence of any follow-up correspondence in either institution's accessible files. A consultation request that's specific, addressed to an institution that specific, would ordinarily produce either a substantive reply that both parties would retain, or a reply indicating that no relevant material existed, which both parties would also retain. The record holds neither. The question of who cut stone stairs into the Vishnu Schist of the inner gorge, if that is what the patrol crew found in February of 1934, is a question that the current archaeological consensus of pre-contact North America cannot answer from the evidence it has formally assembled. The oldest documented human presence in the Grand Canyon region dates to approximately 10,000 years before the present, based on split-twig figurines found in caves within the canyon system and dated by radiocarbon analysis. The canyon has been a place of human activity, spiritual significance, and material use across the entirety of that documented span. The ancestral Puebloan people built granaries and dwelling structures within the canyon's side walls during the period between approximately 900 and 1200 of the Common Era, some of them accessible only by routes that required considerable technical skill to navigate. The Havasupai and Hopi and Navajo and Southern Paiute communities all hold traditions connecting their histories to the canyon across timelines that predate the period for which archaeological evidence has been assembled into a coherent account. Any of those traditions might preserve memory of a period and a people for whom cutting into the schist of the inner gorge was a project worth undertaking at the scale the patrol crew described. None of them have been asked, in any formal institutional context that produced a public record, what they know about stone markings on the wall near the Little Colorado confluence. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, in its statement of the year 2000, noted that certain places within the canyon carry significance that the frameworks currently used to manage the park's historical resources are not equipped to address. The statement did not specify which places. It did not need to. It addressed the gap between what the institutions know and what the communities hold, and it asked, without demanding, that the gap be acknowledged before anything else can be said about what the canyon contains. The systematic survey of the inner gorge has never been completed in a form whose results are publicly accessible. Powell documented the river in 1869 from a series of boats moving through it under considerable pressure and danger. The topographic surveys of the early 20th century mapped the canyon's rim and the major accessible side canyons, but left the vertical faces of the inner gorge largely undescribed, because the equipment and the access methods of the period could not reach those surfaces with the precision a survey would require. More recent LiDAR surveys have produced surface topography maps of the canyon at resolutions no 19th century surveyor would have believed achievable with any technology. The published datasets from those surveys do not, as they currently exist in any publicly accessible form, address the vertical schist faces of the inner gorge in the sections near the Little Colorado confluence at the resolution required to identify a carved formation set below the ordinary waterline. The formation the patrol crew described in 1934 exists in the intersection of several gaps in the systematic record. The gap left by every survey method that could not reach the wall at the required scale, the gap created by a closure order whose internal documentation did not pass into the public archive, and the gap produced by decades of institutional practice that placed the knowledge held by the Havasupai and the Hopi outside the evidentiary frameworks used to decide what the canyon contained and what it did not. The Havasupai know the canyon's inner geography in a way no published survey has recorded. The Hopi know the wall and the stone markings in a way that Alexander Stevens' manuscript preserves, and the published version of his work does not contain. The patrol crew who found the staircase described it to a superintendent who wrote it into the record 3 times in a document that ends without saying what it means, and then filed a closure order that bought 31 days and produced nothing the public record can read. The canyon holds what the canyon holds. The schist does not reclassify what is cut into it because the institution above it chose not to file the photographs. The steps go down into the dark where the river used to run lower, where the Hopi tradition says the markings were placed by the people who came before, where the patrol boat moved through thin February light in 1934 and found something the superintendent described 3 times as not consistent with natural formation, and then, as carefully as he could manage, stopped describing at all. The river runner who moves through the inner gorge today on a permitted trip does so within a regulatory framework that has been in place since 1972, when the Park Service established the permit system that currently governs access to the Colorado through the canyon. The stretch near the Little Colorado confluence is not closed. Thousands of people have passed through it in the decades since the 1934 administrative order was lifted. What any given river runner sees from a boat moving through that corridor is determined by the river level on that particular day, the angle of light reaching the gorge at that hour, the speed at which the boat is moving past the schist walls, and whether there is any reason to look closely at a wall face that, at ordinary water levels and in ordinary light, reads as undifferentiated dark rock. The formation the patrol crew found in February of 1934 was visible because the river was lower than it had been in the entire period of recorded observation, and they were close enough to the wall, and the winter light was at the right angle, and they were moving slowly enough that the regularity of the feature registered before they passed it. Those conditions have not been systematically reproduced. No survey has gone into the gorge specifically to look for what the patrol crew described, at the water level and in the light conditions that would make it visible if it is still there. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.